if you can all get seated, we'll start the next presentation. This is Ashia Monet. She pronouns are she, her, or they, them. She is an Arospec speculative fiction author whose stories focus on queer people of color, as well as the importance and beauty of platonic relationships, usually including magic and monsters wherever she can fit them in. She is the author of the coming novel, The Black Veins, the first in the Dead Magic series.
Hi, everyone. So glad more than one person showed up. I'm already very happy. Just wanted to say, because the presenters before me mentioned this, if you wanted to live tweet any of this or like talk about this on any social media, that's all fine and cool. That's what you want to do. Otherwise, you can just enjoy. So, in our modern world, we are inundated with media, from TV shows to movies to cinematic film universes. We are surrounded by a plethora of characters and exhilarating stories set in worlds that we can only dream of. And to suggest that art has no impact on our lives would be to completely misunderstand this. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is a really good modern day example of something that went from this tiny comic book universe to a worldwide sensation where we all know about it. It's part of pretty much all of our lives. We either hate it or we love it, but we all know what it is. And so we live in an age where entertainment trumps almost all other experiences. We buy merch to proudly wear references to our favorite TV shows in the hopes that someone will know what it is and talk to us about it. We display bags filled with pins from video game characters, movie references, comic book heroes. It goes on and on and on. And in a world where media is so prevalent, where media has such a huge impact on us, representation is even more important. Not only does it allow for marginalized people to have a moment in the spotlight, which is something we rarely get, it also allows for others who don't share our marginalizations to hopefully understand the experience a little bit more. It also allows for an audience member to see a work that they enjoy and be able to look at a character that may look like them or acts like them or have something in common with them and say, hey, you know, that looks like me. Now, having said that, I have a question for all of you. I kind of want you to raise your hand if you've ever read a book, watched a movie, read a comic or anything, and just sort of thought to yourself, like, I'm really enjoying this world, I'm really enjoying these characters, but this romance subplot is just throwing me off. You guys got it? Oh, whole room! Great, we got it! You guys are gonna love this talk. So, as an aromantic reader and viewer and audience member, this is something that happens for me constantly, as it seems to happen for you guys too. I'm always on the outskirts of those romantic feelings and those romantic relationships and those subplots because they're feelings that I personally can't relate to. And because of this, I take a more objective view on romantic subplots, and I assume you guys do too. You will watch something and sort of look from a more objective standpoint at the relationship versus, oh my god, I love her too. You know what I mean? Where you can feel for a character, you won't necessarily romantically be attracted to the character. Yes.
For me, just like how well the romance is done. Like if
That's valid as
if
well.
it's like a slow burn romance where you can see like the emotional strength between the characters versus like, oh my god, he's so perfect.
Exactly. Yes, that as well. That is definitely exactly what I mean by objectively. We kind of look at it and say, how well is this done? Versus falling immediately for a character based on maybe appearance or a couple lines. This ability to have an objective look is why I feel so isolated by storyline sometimes, and why sometimes we'll look at a work and say, I can't really relate to this work. This ability to look objectively at it developed in my 20s, but me being an aromantic viewer, I've been that my whole life. But it's not something that I was able to articulate when I was a young child. And as a teenager, reading young adult literature, I quickly realized that the genre's preoccupation with romance was not one that I shared, but it wasn't necessarily their preoccupation with romance that made me feel excluded. It was their insistence that romance was the most important source of human interaction and relationships, which is something I just inherently could not agree with, even though I didn't, as a teenager, have the words for it. Your teenage years are some of the most important developmental milestones of your life. They're your first steps into becoming the adult you are destined to be for the rest of your life. And because of this, I see young adult literature, which I will now be referring to as YA for short, as a very important form of media. If it does what it claims, it provides stories to teenagers, which is at a very important time of their life, and it has the potential to provide important representation when audience members need it most. So today we will be discussing ammonormativity in YA, centering romance, Arospec-friendly YA novels, and we will be doing an excerpt from my book, The Black Veins, that I think you guys are going to enjoy. Especially now since you guys said you guys aren't about that. I'm really feeling it. So I don't necessarily want to present you with a list of ways that like YA sucks and like here's my idea of how we're going to make it better. What I really mainly want to do is that by the end of this talk, you will understand some of the ways that aromantic readers feel excluded from the current climate of the young adult literature, and several ways to improve this sense of inclusion going forward in terms of story and storytelling, and the ways that several authors are already making these steps in YA right now. So what is YA? You probably recognize it as a genre that should have died in 2013 after producing a lot of really lackluster movies. You probably know it as Twilight, The Hunger Games, and movies that were trying to be one of them. You would be valid because that is an aspect of YA. It's an aspect of YA that is distinctly in the past, but it's part of it all the same. Estee Maas currently has her own little empire that I try my best to avoid, but I can't not mention her because she's currently the queen of YA.
Literatu and like Black are also like cool authors who include good representation.
Yes, so definitely. Yes. I definitely agree. I have Literatu up here as well.
We'll save comments for the end.
Sorry. I apologize.
It's okay. It's okay. But yeah, so Throne of Glass I included because S.J. Maas, like I said, is basically such a huge powerhouse in YA at the moment. But YA is also a genre that's going through a resurgence right now. A number of new, talented authors, often from marginalized backgrounds, are coming forth with amazing stories and characters from a rainbow's array of experiences and backgrounds with more than enough talent to adequately tell their story, which is why we have things like The Poet X, The Sun is Also a Star, To All the Boys I Loved Before, which was recently adapted to Netflix, and I'm sure you all know about The Hate U Give. YA, when compared to other communities, it's still relatively small. Even some of the big hitters in our community aren't necessarily household names. I know not everyone knows who S.J. Maas is, even though she is like pretty much one of the biggest names in the current YA world. She's still not yet a household name. And like even the most popular works like Twilight, Hunger Games, etc., they became very popular because they had a lot of crossover appeal, which means that people outside of the YA community could look at that and say, oh, I like it. But it may still be considered cringy and people still laugh at it sometimes, but the truth is that it has a lot of potential and it has a lot of influence. And it can have a huge, huge impact on the lives of many readers, often very young readers. YA is a lot of things. It is a genre, it's a community, it's a series of repetitive tropes, it is unapologetically cringy, and it is often the reason why many people learn to love reading. It's a force to be reckoned with, and I don't think that it should be ignored. Which is why diverse representation is so important for YA as a whole, but not only diverse representation, specifically a romantic representation and acknowledgement. So, this is me as a teen. I realized it was extremely self-centered to include a really long anecdote about myself, complete with pictures. But I do want to put a personal note into this talk because before I was an aromantic writer, I was an aromantic reader, and specifically a very young one. Back when I was a target demographic for YA, which wasn't long ago, I'm only 20. Everything was either Hunger Games, Twilight, or for some reason Harry Potter, because people thought Harry Potter was YA. It's not, it's middle grade. More you know. And if you weren't one of those three things, or badly emulating one of those three things, or trying to mash all three of them up to get some vampire, magician, Hunger Games stuff going on all at once, you weren't easily accessible, to be honest. You weren't going to be in every bookstore. You weren't going to be in Targets. You weren't going to be necessarily in every library. For the most part, the most popular YA were the books that got to be in all of these specific places and got to be easily accessible by people who had the means to acquire them. And I specifically remember books like these, like Cinder, Graceling, Beautiful Creatures, a countless number of books like these that I spent like so much time reading. And I went through YA novel after YA novel because I'd loved reading since I was young, and middle grade never steered me wrong, so I naively trusted YA as well. And it quickly became apparent to me that most of these books featured very consistently overbearing romantic subplots. It wasn't a problem to me yet when I first got started. I easily realized that I wasn't on board with this, and I was reading it, and I was like, you know what, I'm not really a fan of most of the way YA does romantic subplots. And so I was good at sorting out what kind of media I did and didn't want to consume. So I went on the hunt for an oxymoron that I didn't realize was an oxymoron. I wanted a young adult novel without romance. It didn't exist. I did not find one, even though I was trying very, very hard to locate one, which goes back to the idea of accessibility. I'm from Philadelphia, Germantown. Weren't a lot of libraries around. So the places that I did get to go to, they would have Hunger Games, YA, Harry Potter, all of the big hitters, most of which included lots and lots and lots of romance. And when I realized that every book I picked up would include a romantic subplot, usually one that would slowly overtake the elements of the book that I found most appealing, like the magic system or the robots or anything like that, I realized that this was common across the entire genre itself of YA, and I began to wonder if something was then wrong with me. Because YA was popular, my friends loved it, I enjoyed most of it, but I just couldn't get past the romance. And I read a ton of these books to try to make myself care. I tried to make myself invested in the romantic subplot where the girl pines so hard after this love interest who is such a perfect person that he doesn't even feel real. I tried to invest myself in fictional relationships where the two people hate each other, but then love each other because one thing happened and he like brought her a flower or something. And now they're making out. I love it. They're getting married tomorrow, by the way. And I tried to make myself care because surely this many people couldn't be wrong. Surely I was the broken one because I was a young aromantic reader who didn't know that they were an aromantic reader. And this lack of knowledge about such a huge part of myself is common, especially for a lot of young kids. You don't always understand every aspect of the identity you're born with. For most of us, it's a journey, a process to uncover the mystery of our souls and what works for us and what doesn't. And media is an important tool to help us along the way. It allows us to look at people and identities we may not see in our day-to-day lives and gives us the opportunity to see someone we may potentially relate to. And sadly, at this point in young adult literature, there was absolutely nothing for me as an aromantic reader. And thinking something was inherently wrong with me is exactly what happens when you go out and look for yourself in the world and find nothing of yourself out there. You begin to think that you are the only one. And you begin to think that you are broken, that you are the only one who does not fit in this perfect world where everyone else is happy. I was very much still within the age bracket that YA targets, and I was discovering my likes and my dislikes and blossoming into the adult I would soon become, grappling desperately at any sort of similarity in media that could pull me along. And that is the power that YA holds, to put out a helping hand to teens forming their identities, to say you are heard, you matter, and you are not broken. But when I was a teenager, there was no hand for me. Instead, there was a vast emptiness and isolation that made me question my very core. Some things changed in my life, and I got tired of trying to adapt to YA standards. Thank God. As an older teenager, around 17, I sort of took a step back and I looked at YA and understood that the genre itself had a preoccupation with romance, and that perhaps it just wasn't for me. And so I left YA to find myself in webcomics and comics and D&D podcasts called The Adventure Zone, and other forms of storytelling that featured friendship as primary relationships. At this point, I kind of just said, okay, YA maybe just sucks. I don't want to have to think about it. I don't want to deal with it at all. But the truth is that I was not the only aromantic teenager in the world, and I'm definitely not the only aromantic teenager who read YA. My experience with YA has to be one that is experienced with many others. I came to YA because I love to read, and I wanted to see what the genre could offer me. The premises and promises their stories offer are incredibly tempting. I mean, come on. Bella fell in love with a vampire, that's fun. What's up with that? And to suggest that nobody cares about YA or that it doesn't have any appeal would be foolish. And YA is too large, it's too vast, too wide to ignore its teen audience like that, to leave them floundering. And I don't think that this is just a genre we should just put off and say they're irrelevant. I think we should work to improve it. So the question then becomes, how do we do that? How do we make sure that aromantic teens don't feel excluded by YA? Well, before we can solve this problem, we have to identify it. What really is the problem? If teen me could love rom-coms and sitcoms and other movies with romantic plot lines, why did YA make me feel like I why was the problem? What was and what is YA doing wrong that makes aromantic readers feel excluded? So, on June 8th, I chose Pride Month because I figured this would probably be on people's minds. I conducted a Twitter poll for anyone who identified as aromantic to answer some questions about media representation and romantic relationships. My sample size was questionable, and I admittedly had very little screening for participants to actually identify as aromantic besides saying, answer if you're aromantic. And we all know how much people on Twitter like to just click and don't really read it. So, I'm sorry, I am a writer and a psychology major. I'm not a statistician. I don't really have a really large reach, but I did what I could. Next question. Sorry, next slide. So the first question asks if people could still enjoy a piece of media if it were primarily focused on romance. Most people answered that they could, and I agree. I love rom-coms and romance novels, and in fact, I think I've seen To All the Boys I Loved Before 3 times, but that may just be because there's a lot of pink in it, and I love pink. I also love cheesy and cliche fun things, but that's another story. Clearly, the problem with YA is not the fact that it includes romance. Question 2 asked about people's favorite form of non-romantic relationships. Most people answered friendship, but it was very closely tied with both friendship and familial relationships. I agree, obviously, I wrote a whole book about a bunch of people being friends, and I was very happy with it. And I will make more books about that. Next slide. Question 3 deals with people taking issue with romantic relationships being treated as the pinnacle of human relationships. Most people said yes, with somewhat being the next most popular option. And finally, I asked if people think a prominent non-romantic relationship is important to include. And 88% of participants answered yes, which is a very large number of people. Pretty much everyone said yes. So what does this have to do with YA? We're going to break down all these ideas one at a time. YA is known for including romance in almost all of its novels, no matter how ridiculous or unwarranted it may be. But era readers can still enjoy romance, so that can't be the primary problem. We would prefer for romance not to be treated as the most important form of human interaction, which is where YA starts getting a bit tricky. While attempting to depict the all-consuming nature of a teenager's first love, YA often walks the line between understanding that romantic love can be very powerful and treating romantic love as the only powerful and relevant important form of love. YA is also known for focusing most of its attention on the main character and love interest, usually leaving other relationships to the side, which hits against the biggest question here, which is that era readers love non-romantic relationships, especially friendships, but YA seems to stray away from almost all non-romantic relationships prominently in a work. You will have often side plots or side characters who are cousins, brothers, families, friends, and those relationships will be shown partially in a work, but most of the page time will be devoted to the romantic relationship. So, as I said, it is not the inclusion of romance that is the issue. We can still, for the most part, appreciate a bit of lovey-dovey hard eyes in a work. The issue appears when works try to convince us that this romantic relationship is the most important aspect of not only the characters' lives, but the world at large, and the universe in and outside of it, and focuses on this relationship to the detriment of every other non-romantic relationship in the work. This is known as ammonormativity. You can try saying it if you want. Ammonormativity? Ammonormativity. It's a very long word, but I feel like it encapsulates this very well. It's a term created by Elizabeth Brake. She's a professor of philosophy, and it concerns the centering and overgeneralization of romantic culture. Brake defined ammonormativity as the following. This is long. Here we go. The belief that marriage and companionate romantic love have special value leads to overlooking the value of other caring relationships. I, Elizabeth, not Asia, call this disproportionate focus on marital and amorous love relationships as special sites of value and the assumption that romantic love is a universal goal, ammonormativity. This consists in the assumption that a central, exclusive, amorous relationship is normal for humans, in that it is a universally shared goal, and that such a relationship is normative, and that it should be aimed at in preference to other relationship types. The assumption that valuable relationships must be marital or amorous devalues friendships and other caring relationships, as recent manifestos by urban tribalists, quirky-alones, polyamorous, and asexuals, and aromantics have insisted. Amornormativity prompts the sacrifice of other relationships to romantic love and marriage and relegates friendships and solitudinous to cultural invisibility. So, amornormativity is the issue. The insistence that romance is the end goal for everyone, that lives are incomplete without it, that every single character in a work cares primarily for their romantic issues will lead, definitely, to discouraging aromantic viewers and readers. Ignoring and decentering non-romantic relationships, friends, parents, grandparents, everyone that I mentioned before, all manners of non-romantic and non-sexual relationships in favor of a romantic relationship is being complicit in amornormativity. This is what leads to isolating Arospec identities. Within any context, even outside of YA in the world of literature, in real life, the pressure of family, friends, culture, society can create an oppressive environment for anyone with an arospectual identity. Amornormativity is not just something that exists on a page. It's in real life. It's an actual form of oppression. So YA is flooded with amornormativity to the point where you would be hard-pressed to pick up a single book without a scathing romantic plotline that most of the time overtakes the primary plot, as we mentioned before. So I am not the end-all, be-all of Arospec creators. I can definitely give you a few pointers from my own experience and media I enjoy, but this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. This is just a couple ideas of places to start if you are a writer, or if you know any writers, potentially, and you would like to give them a few pointers. What I want you to walk away with is a working understanding and knowledge of how to really center prominent non-romantic relationships and anchor them in importance in a novel. First of all, we all understand amornormativity. We know that that is something that we want to avoid in our writing, but what else could we do? We want to include non-romantic relationships that are complex. And by complex, I mean that we want to avoid being stagnant. And stagnant characters and stagnant relationships are the stable rock of a person that your main character can always turn to, the outgoing best friend who disappears for the second half of the novel, the loving parent who endlessly supports them whenever the plot requires it, but otherwise do not have a life of their own or any other real interactions with the main characters. This works great in real life. We all love having the friend that's always there for us, but it's boring in fiction, okay? Like, nobody wants to read about them getting along all the time. Conflict drives story, and it gives a reason to give page time to these characters. You need a conflict in order to have a story, and therefore, if you want to further develop your platonic and familiar characters, you're gonna have to introduce some form of conflict. Sorry. This isn't to say put your main character into a toxic friendship or a toxic household to get them to interact with friends and family, not at all. But you want to establish these characters as people. You, for example, disagreeing with your main character's course of action could be something for the best friend that's super outgoing to do. You could have the parent, the sibling, the cousin, the aunt go on an adventure of their own. Maybe it helps the main character. Maybe it hinders them. Make your non-romantic characters as important and dynamic as your love interests. You want to ground them in importance and understanding. One thing to note about YA in particular is how crucial character development is to the genre. In fact, in most cases, character development literally is the story. It might be set in space. There might be monsters from alternate dimensions seeping in. The character might be spending a week in Paris with only $300, but this is YA, so it's all just a cover for a very dramatic coming-of-age story, because that's what we do here. And what you want to do is develop that relationship with the non-romantic character and house it in the character's character development. And what I mean by that is that you want to tie it to the main character's personal development in order to make sure that this is not an ignorable point of the story. In YA, usually only the main character's relationship with their love interest is directly tied to their character development. It is their relationship with the love interest that makes them grow and discover themselves and go off and live their best life. But it is crucial to tie your non-love interest characters into your main character's character development as well. It will make them more of a side plot, more of a character that can't be erased with little consequence, and it makes them important. You also want to appreciate your non-love interest characters as much as your main characters and love interests, because of course we all have favorites, but a book is kind of like pho. And I love pho, so of course I had to work it into here. And have you guys ever had pho? It's Vietnamese.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good, right? It's delicious.
Yeah.
One of the best things about pho is that every element of it is so so good. It doesn't matter what part you get, you can just like pick your fork up and just get some noodles. You're gonna be happy that you got those noodles because the noodles are good, right? But you pick up another forkful and now you got veggies and noodles. Bang it, right? It's amazing. You want your novel to be like a good bowl of pho. Every element should pull its weight. You don't want it to be in a predicament where you end up with two of the most boring characters in the book and suddenly the scene sucks. Every character should have their own importance that they bring to the novel. Every character has their own flair. It might not be a flair that every reader will like, but you want to have something memorable in that character for the readers to either relate to or dislike. It's okay if the readers dislike a character. Sometimes what you need is just an emotional reaction so that they can identify some emotion with the character that's not, oh yeah, I forgot about them because they never did anything. You don't want to write dull characters just because they're not your primary two. You want to treat every character with love and with as much love and dedication as you would if they were the love interest of the main character. You don't want to center so firmly on your love interest that it distracts from the plot, because if you're not writing a romance, oh my god, please do not focus so much on the romance that everything gets like thrown out the window. Because for readers who aren't reading for romance, this is equivalent to story death. You will guarantee that the audience who came for all the non-romantic aspects of your story will be frustrated, because YA, as I've noticed, is a very huge culprit of this. Entire plots will be dropped in favor of scenes where the main character and the romantic interest have a very, very, very boring conversation. But they're talking to each other, and that's all you should care about, is what YA wants you to think. That's not true. Please get back to the giant monsters. If you find yourself potentially falling into this trap, or if someone you know is writing a story that might fall into this trap, there are some ways around it. One of them is to list out the points of all the major scenes in your novel. And what you can do is create a scene-by-scene outline of every scene in your novel, and you want to label the scene as either romantic and non-plot-based, non-romantic and plot-based, or romantic and plot-based. You want the first two that I mentioned to be even, so that you have an equal number of romantic and non-plot-based scenes and non-romantic and plot-based scenes, so that readers who maybe don't really emphasize with the romantic nature of your novel can still enjoy it, even though they aren't necessarily invested in the romantic relationship. Like I said, this is especially true if you're not writing a romance or a story that should technically heavily feature romance. If you want to write a heavily romance novel, cool, sell it as such. What we don't want is dishonesty or the continued trend of YA novels spending paragraphs explaining the world in their synopsis and like one sentence that mentions the romance that you think, oh, the romance probably isn't going to be a big part until you open it and you realize that's the book. Again, this is not meant to be the end-all, be-all of things to do. It's just a list of potential ideas. There's also a final really big idea that I do firmly believe ought to be a norm. Consider if a romance arc is truly required for your story. Because sometimes you don't need one, especially for YA, where bad romances seem to trump the idea of no romance or for a platonic relationship. We need more friendship stories anyway. Friendships are core to every teenager. It is something they can relate to and when written well, do want to read about. Because I know that the idea of having friends or maybe not having friends is crucial in high school. Your friend group makes up your experience. So to write about that could be potentially a very interesting story, especially female friendship. There's a unique bond between teen girls who are friends, and I'd like to see more depictions of that, especially in YA, whose demographic is primarily teen girls. There is a shocking lack of books about teen girl friendships. Not to negate the importance of any other gender, just mentioning that this, which is such a huge part of their target demographic, is constantly ignored, which I think is very backwards logic. Gay and lesbian solidarity is also always fun. Not to mention families, which are starting to feature more prominently in YA, but we could always use more family stories, familial relationships who are more than just side characters. We could also make them main characters. Many stories are culprits, including my own, of sort of getting rid of the family and letting the characters go off on their own adventure. But I would like to see more incorporations of the family into the story, more cousins, aunts, uncles, moms, dads, maybe unique family structures to really have fun with the type of story that people are telling. This benefits not only Arospec teen readers, but also our romantic readers who maybe just want a break from reading about romance. And it also benefits authors who are not good at writing romance. And it's potentially the perfect solution. Everyone wins, all is well, except for, of course, the people who I will now address. If you're worried about alienating a large portion of your audience, you will. But you do that with everything you write. Fantasy alienates people who don't like fantasy. If you write about characters who aren't white, cis, heterosexual, etc., you are alienating people who don't want to read diversely or about minorities. Regardless of what you create, you are choosing to prioritize one audience over another. You will lose an audience that often reads for romance, but you will gain an audience that is often ignored and undervalued. And that is a choice only you can make. You can decide what you want to write for and what you want to write about. But I want people to understand that there's nothing wrong with straying away from romance. Amnormativity will tell you that there is. Amnormativity wants you to think that it is the norm and that it is perfectly normal for it to be so prevalent. It isn't, and it doesn't have to remain the standard. I say this because I had this very talk with myself before promoting my own novel. I was scared to say that The Black Veins was a no love interest YA because it felt like, as I mentioned before, an oxymoron. It felt like YA was supposed to have a romantic subplot and that my book wouldn't be valid because it didn't. And I feel like I was terrified when I used that phrase, that when I said those words, that I would remain alone forever. But I told myself that I wasn't the only one. And if you look at the Black Veins Goodreads page, you can see it there in bold that it is a no love interest YA, because I wanted to write for Arospec readers and teens who had been forgotten and ignored. And that phrase resonated with a lot of people, and it ended up being what people loved most about that book. Arospec readers and Alromantic readers alike. A lot of Alromantic readers actually told me that they thought that was pretty cool that I decided not to include a love interest. I was told it felt like a breath of fresh air or something they've been searching desperately for. And so if you choose to not include romance into your novel, you will find an audience and they will read your work. Excellent. So these are a few recommendations for books that you can check out if you want to know books that are currently featuring no romance art and characters that are on the Arospec spectrum. These usually feature I know this features a romantic main character, this features an Aro ace main character, and this one features a romantic side character. This one just features a friendship story as its pinnacle. There is no romance arc. Next one. So this is my novel. Hi. I was going to read a short excerpt from it, but we're running short on time. So I will just mention a little bit about it. The importance of friendship narratives are obviously very central to me. I believe a lot in them. And I didn't write this book to make a statement. I just wrote it because I wanted to celebrate friendship, especially friendships where everyone is a little different from each other, but you all love and support each other unconditionally. It is described as follows. 16-year-old Blith is one of 7 guardians, magicians powerful enough to cause worldwide panic with a snap of their fingers. But Blith spends her days pouring latte art at her family's coffee shop, so why should she care about having apocalyptic abilities? She's given a reason when magician anarchists crash into said coffee shop and kidnap her family. Heartbroken but determined, Blith knows she can't leave them alone. A war is brewing between 2 magician governments and tensions are too high, so she packs up her family's bright yellow Volkswagen, puts on a playlist, and embarks on a road trip across the United States to enlist the help of 6 strangers whose abilities are unparalleled, the other Guardians. I often say it's the book version of the montage scene where they go around, they're like, we need your help. Here it is. So my heart obviously rests in this book. It's filled with a lot of queer people of color. It's filled with a lot of humor. It's filled with fun, and it is filled with friendship and no romance arc for this book, which obviously was a conscious choice that I made because I realized I wanted to focus primarily on the friendship between the 7 characters and not necessarily any sort of romantic tensions going on underneath. I didn't want to name this talk How to Write Aro Characters because that's not really the point. Any book you write can be inclusive and Aro friendly, even romance novels. Because the point isn't don't write romance, the point is don't give in to amnormativity, don't write romance as if it is a universal experience that is the pinnacle of human relationships, and don't forget about your friends and the people who feel like family. Thank you. Next one. That was for my reading. Next one. I was gonna play some music for you guys. This is where you can find me. I'm on Instagram at Asia Writes and Twitter at Asia Monet. If you also want to email me, I am at asiamonet@gmail.com. I also have business cards. Please come get them. I ordered them from Canva for this specific event. They're very pretty, I promise. Also, obviously, I will be here and around if you ever want to talk to me. So yes, thank you guys so much for being such a great audience. You made me feel very comfortable. I really appreciated this. So thank you again.